It makes such a difference to be known. I was recruited to play basketball in college, beginning my career at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. My freshman year, about 30 players tried out for the team, most of whom had been recruited. Now, when you're a recruited player, you assume something very basic but very important. You simply assume that the coaches know you because they've invested time and energy in recruiting you, in contacting you, and trying to persuade you to come to their school. Therefore, it only stands to reason that they should know who you are, don't you think? Well, I'll never forget my first day going to the gym to play with all of the incoming freshman recruits. Each one of us eager to impress the coaches to ensure our spot on the team. As we roamed around the court warming up, one of the coaches began to mingle, shaking hands and talking with the various freshman players. When he finally approached me, he stretched out his hand, and the first thing he said to me was, "And who are you?" He didn't know me. I was so disappointed. I figured I was done for. How would I ever make the team when I was an unknown entity amidst so many who were known? I thought I was a known recruit, but it turned out that I was just a name on a list. I wasn't really known. I was in for an uphill battle. To be known, truly known, made such a difference, doesn't it? For example, in a relationship, when we are truly known, we can be ourselves. We can be confident that we'll be understood and accepted. In a job, when we are known, we can have greater security and easier access to the people with authority. It's so nice to be known. Well, today we're going to delve into a psalm that shouts out, "You are known." Or better yet, the theme of this psalm is, "He knows us." So I invite you to turn to Psalm 139. This is a well-known and well-loved psalm. Now, the context for this psalm is highly debated by scholars, and they've suggested a variety of possibilities. However, I submit to you that the purpose of this psalm is to make it crystal clear that God knows us, and that this knowledge of us has definite implications for our lives. This is evident from how the psalm begins and how it ends. Notice in verse 1, the psalmist intones, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." He then ends the psalm with a request in verse 23, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." God has searched him and does know him ever so deeply. But the battles and trials and the living of life require that we constantly be reminded and that we continually pursue this intimate being known by God. This psalm represents a profoundly personal interaction between the author and his God. Throughout the psalm, the author is directly addressing God. In this way, it is clearly a prayer. But it's not some dry, formal recitation. It is in every way a communion with God, a genuine conversation directed from one person to another. The author speaks to God as you, and he does so in relationship to me or my or I. For example, notice verses 1 to 3. The psalmist says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways." This is prayer as personal encounter, not as some laborious discipline, but rather as a genuine and intimate meeting between a man and his God. The psalm has something to teach us, therefore, about our communion with God and about how intimate an encounter prayer with him should be. The psalm divides nicely into two sections. In verses 1 to 18, we see the psalmist's recognition of God. Then in verses 19 to 24, the psalmist's petition to God. So let's begin by looking at the psalmist's recognition of God in verses 1 to 18. This first section, the psalmist's recognition of God, divides into three strophes. The first one is in verses 1 to 6, where the psalmist speaks about God's intimate knowledge of us. The psalm begins in verse 1 with the author making a general affirmation, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." The author acknowledges that God has already probed his innermost being and thus has a deep personal knowledge of everything about his existence. He then elaborates on this affirmation in verses 2 to 6, using several merisms, A merism is when the author puts together two polar opposites that emphasize that God knows the full range, everything in between, the two poles and everything in between, he knows. He knows from one extreme to the opposite. For example, first one, you know when I sit down and when I rise up. You search out my path and my lying down. That is, you know me when I'm on the road or when I'm at home. He adds, you discern my thoughts from afar and are acquainted with all my ways. So no matter the distance, no matter the activity, no matter the context, God knows, God searches out, God sees and examines everything about us, from thoughts to actions. And if this were not enough, verse 4 claims, before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. So completely does God know us, so exhaustively, that he knows the words we will speak before they are even formed, when they're still mere ideas in our minds. And just in case we think we can escape the spotlight of his penetrating knowledge, verse 5 adds, you hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. That is, he's like a huge hedge that completely encircles us, keeping us in the center of his presence and influence. And to ensure that we don't move from this place, his massive loving hand rests upon us, keeping us there. His presence is the very environment in which we live. It is like a vast searchlight that exposes our every movement and thought and motivation. The recognition of such an exhaustive and profound knowledge of us leads the psalmist to conclude in verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. There's both a sense of awe, of wonderment, and fear as the author recognizes that his life and all that he is forever exposed to God's limitless knowledge. He's completely uncovered, thoroughly known by God. That's the first strophe. The second strophe, in verses 7 to 12, talk about God's inescapable presence with us. The second strophe has an immediate change of tone. The psalmist begins in verse 7 with two rhetorical questions. First, where shall I go from your spirit? And then, where shall I flee from your presence? In other words, he's affirming that it's totally impossible to flee from God, to escape from his presence. He then gives the evidence for this conviction in verses 8 to 12. Once again, he uses several merisms, those polar opposites, to prove his point. If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. God inhabits the highest of all places, heaven itself. And he also inhabits the lowest parts, even Sheol, the place of the dead, a place that the ancients viewed as the lowest part of existence. Even if I plumb the depths of the sea, God is there. God's presence is absolutely inescapable. He is everywhere, in every moment, forever. Now, it's not that he's so fast that he moves from one place to the next at mind-boggling speed. Rather, it's that he's so immense, so vast, so all-encompassing, that his presence covers all of existence at one time. He is literally everywhere, always. He's omnipresent. So, given that it's impossible to find a place where he is not, the psalmist thinks, perhaps I can hide myself in one of these places where he is, so that though he's there, he won't be able to see me. But the psalmist quickly debunks this foolish idea in verses 11 and 12. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. God sees even in the darkest of places. His eyes penetrate the thickest fog and pierce through the blackest nights. He sees in every hidden place and behind every barrier. As Proverbs 15:3 says, the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Nothing ever escapes his view. No one can ever flee from his presence. That's the second strophe. The third strophe, in verses 13 to 18, talk about God's personal design of us. Now, you'll notice that this third strophe begins with the word for. which translates what's called a causal conjunction, which simply means that what the author is saying in this section is the cause for something he previously stated. I think we could sum up the idea this way. Why is it that God has such an all-encompassing knowledge of me? Why is it that he knows me so completely, so intimately? Verses 13 to 18 give the answer. It's because he is your creator, the one who made you. As the awestruck writer affirms, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. The image the psalmist paints is of a potter forming the clay in a precious pot, or of a master weaver knitting a lovely garment. It was in this way that God was intimately involved in the creation of the psalmist's life. A thought that fills his heart and mouth with a song of praise in verse 14. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Is there anything more amazing than knowing that you are purposely formed by the Master's hand? He made you just the way you are. You are the product of his majestic artistry. We are not the product of some natural accident. We were formed by the divine potter, purposely, ever so carefully, intimately. He was there during the whole formation process, in the secret recesses of our mother's womb, working, knitting our being together to make us what we are, what he wanted us to be. And this was not some random act, not some spontaneous creation. It was done according to an eternal design, as verse 16 affirms. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Before the foundation of the world, long before the physical union of our parents, God's creating work was already planned out. The design that your existence would be molded after was already determined. And God was there in the darkness and hiddenness of the womb, forming us in his image and for his glory. But this profoundly intimate interest that God has in our lives is not reserved only for the distant past when he formed us. Even now, his concern for our every breath and movement is evident. He's continually thinking about us, as the psalmist exclaims in verses 17 and 18, how precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I could count them, they're more than the sand. I awake and I am still with you. God's tenderly, fatherly care is still active toward us and is constantly evident through the multitude of thoughts that he has about us each and every moment. He is still with us, and his hand is still here to guide us. His thoughts still overflow toward us. The truth is, his presence is inescapable. His knowledge of us incomparable. But it's just at this point, a point of extreme praise and deep reflection over the intimate knowledge that God has of us, that the psalmist suddenly, radically changes his tone. Which leads us to the second part of the psalm, the psalmist's petition to God in verses 19 to 24. The second section of the psalm is much shorter, but much more intense. The psalmist makes two basic petitions. His first petition in verses 19 to 22 is a petition to defeat the wicked. This first petition is a raw, unfiltered blast that comes as a total surprise. The psalmist is in the midst of his praise of God's amazing attributes, and suddenly he screams in evident agony, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God! O men of blood, depart from me!" What has happened? The psalmist's eyes have been focused on heaven, on the beauty and grandeur of the omnicompetent God. But suddenly he lowers his eyes and sees the sad reality of life all around him. What does he see? He sees the presence of sinful humankind. He sees wicked people sullying God's creation and seeking to thwart God's purposes. Now, what are these sinful people like? The author mentions two of their sins. First, he sees men of blood, murderous people, violent people, people who have surrounded him, seeking to do him harm. And second, he hears as they speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. They are blasphemers who slander God, whose malicious designs seek to tarnish God's glory. David cannot tolerate such belittling of the amazing God who knows him so intimately. So his heart bursts with emotion, with the disgust he feels toward these wicked people. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. David's invective against the wicked must be understood in its context. The basis of his hatred is that the wicked are opposing God. They're blaspheming him and maliciously contradicting him. It's not really a personal attack against specific people. It's instead David's passionate defense of God, the response of a lover when his beloved is mistreated. The depth of his love for God leads him to express hatred towards all those who hate his God. It is a passionate expression of righteous anger, raw and unfiltered. It is meant to focus on the great unworthiness of those people and the great worthiness of the all-holy, deeply personal God and the unthinkable horror of anyone who would seek to do him harm. That's the first petition. The second petition is a petition to examine his life in verses 23 and 24. Here we have another surprising turn by the author. In the middle of this deeply emotional outburst against the wicked, the psalmist, instead of continuing his petition that God would judge sinners, suddenly turns inward and asks the all-searching God to shine his penetrating light on the psalmist's own inner life. He cries out, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." The petition is for God to expose his deepest thoughts, his most profound motives. Examine me, God, to see what is really resting at the core of my being. Is this hatred of your enemies truly a righteous anger, or is it nothing less than personal vindictiveness? Am I truly a man of integrity, one who is rightly aligned with you and your purposes? Uncover my inner being, O God. Reveal what I really am on the inside. Expose my true motives, my true thoughts. If there be in me any painful, that's literally what the word means, any painful way, any tendency, any pattern, any habit or action that causes hurt, that offends, that hinders progress in your will, O God, please show me and rip it out of my life. Lead me in the way of eternal life, the way of truth and wisdom. This is David's closing petition. For God to do his heart-mining work that exposes every ugly thing in him and moves him forward down the path towards a truly God-honoring, God-pleasing life. Well, that's Psalm 139. But what does this psalm have to say to us? What are some practical implications for our lives in the day-to-day? There are many, but let me share quickly 5 things that a Psalm 139 knowledge of God should produce in our lives. Number 1, comfort. Psalm 139 reveals to us that our God is omnipresent and omniscient. He is our intimate creator and the one who knows us most completely. This means at least 3 things. It means I am never alone. No matter where I go, no matter how lonely I feel, he is always, always with me. Second, it reveals that I am never unknown. Whether I move to a new place, where I just don't seem to fit in, or I find myself in a sea of faces where nobody knows my name, whether I feel lost and insignificant and unknown, I am known. God knows me completely, exhaustively. He knows every nook and cranny of my life, every foible and flaw. He always knows my greatest hurts, my deepest longings, even my most confused thoughts. He is the one who formed me in my mother's womb, the one who knit me together. He knows everything there is to know about me and more. Thirdly, I am never misunderstood by him, not even a little. He sees things just as they are and knows me just as I am. I can never travel beyond the borders of his love. I can never reach beyond the limits of his grace. I can never dig down deeper than the scope of his forgiveness. His presence, intimate, personal, all-knowing, is absolutely inescapable, which means that his provision for every need is always available, always close at hand, always just right for our need. This should produce in us a profound comfort in every situation. The second implication of this psalm is fear. What produces comfort in some should produce fear in others. For example, the knowledge that I can never hide anything from Him should produce fear in us, especially when it's sin we want to conceal. Do you realize that we are at every moment, in every situation, and in every way, totally naked in His presence? There are no masks that we can wear, no costume, no makeup, which will hide from Him the essence of what we really are, which will cover over what we have really done. Our everything is always fully exposed to His searching eye. There is never any aspect of my being, any action, any thought, any desire that I can conceal from Him. I can never fool Him, never trick Him, never manipulate Him. Imagine for a moment that every thought and every desire you ever had, the very moment it arose inside of you, was suddenly written across your face for everyone to see, exposed for public consumption, visible to your friends and enemies. What would this produce in you? That's exactly how it is with God. He knows my every thought even before it becomes fully formed within my mind. He knows every rebellious inkling, every lustful pining, every sinful motion. He knows what I'm dreaming. He knows what I'm scheming. It is all out in the open before Him. We are completely naked in His sight. This should truly produce a deep fear in us. Thirdly, faith. If this all-seeing, all-knowing, always-present Creator God is your God, then this should not produce in you anything less than an incredibly strong, profoundly deep faith. He who is omnicompetent is perfectly able to do exactly what He promised. He who knows your words before they are formed in your mouth. He whose plans for you were all written in His book long before you were even an idea in your parents' minds. He whose thoughts about you are more numerous than the sand on the seashore. If He is your God, will He not be faithful to accomplish in you His good, pleasing, and perfect will? Trust in this God because He is the one true God. He is the one who can save you, the one who can rip out the weeds of sin from your heart and lead you in the way everlasting, the way to eternal joy and life. Should not knowing this God, this one true God, produce in you a vibrant, living faith? Number 4, transparency. The psalmist ends this song of praise and lament with a heartfelt petition. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. It's a cry for unencumbered intimacy with God, the enjoyment of a relationship free of hypocrisy, free of sinful motives and ungodly thoughts. It's a plea for God to strip away anything and everything that hinders true intimacy with Him. It's an appeal for a truly transparent, deep relationship with God. The psalmist knows that God is an all-seeing and all-knowing God. He recognizes God's penetrating presence. What he wants is to enjoy unfettered communion with this indescribably holy God. To pray this final prayer and to really mean it, to really desire that God's searchlight examine your innermost being and expose what is actually there, is a dangerous prayer. It's a prayer for accountability with God. It's a prayer for total nakedness before Him. It's a prayer giving Him license to root out all the filthy garbage, but also all the cherished treasures of our hearts, and to expose us for what we are and to make us radically different, radically new. If you pray Psalm 139 with a genuine heart, it should produce a vitally transparent heart in you. And finally, praise. At the end of the day, when we recognize the wonder of this omnipresent, omniscient, intimately personal, penetratingly pure God, we are filled with praise. We are overwhelmed by the reality that He formed us with His heavenly hands, that He knew us before we were a speck in our mother's womb, that He continues to know everything about us, even our deepest thoughts and needs. And we are filled with wonder and praise because of his gracious invitation to us to enter into a loving communion with him and to enjoy the life that he freely offers us through his Son, Jesus Christ. If you believe in the God of this psalm, then your life should be filled with praise, with an indescribable delight in the God who knows you. You are known.